studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Friday, September 11th, 2015. 14 years after the September 11th attacks, we'll survey U.S. foreign and domestic policy with Hussam Ayloush of the Council on American Islamic Relations. And we'll examine the trials and travails of Uber, with several legal decisions on drivers who are demanding to be treated as employees. My guest, Stephen Hill, has written a book about the Uber economy. Plus, did you know that American burial practices are highly polluting to the earth? We'll speak with author Suzanne Kelly about green burial. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Senate Democrats slammed a Republican bid to block President Obama's signature foreign policy nuclear deal with Iran. In a vote of 58 to 42, Democrats and independent senators banded together on Thursday to prevent the GOP from getting a filibuster-proof 60 votes to advance a resolution blocking the Iran nuclear deal. The vote marks a major victory for the Obama administration, which worked hard to lobby every lawmaker, despite the GOP-dominated House planning its own vote and Senate Republicans planning a re-vote next week. The opposition to the bill is unlikely to prevail. According to the New York Times, Republicans will use Mr. Obama's triumph, as they did with the healthcare law, as a means to attack Democrats in anticipation of next year's election. The agreement means that Iran will stop pursuing nuclear weapons capabilities in exchange for the lifting of crippling sanctions. Although House Speaker John Boehner warned, we will use every tool at our disposal to stop, slow, and delay this agreement from being fully implemented. Mr. Obama can begin removing sanctions against Iran as early as next week. Well, Cristina, many anti-war groups had lobbied for such a diplomatic effort. Is this a victory for progressives?
Well, I think the answer is a complicated one. On the one hand, it definitely can be seen as progress on the diplomacy side. I think that part of that is a debate between soft and hard power continues to show that hard power, including economic factors like sanctions, don't actually work. So that instead of the continuation of hard power, the U.S. would do better to employ more diplomatic efforts. But I think here's where we need to complicate this deal. And I wonder if anyone is asking questions that would actually reveal some of the roots of the question of nuclear weapons. So we have to remember, for instance, that the U.S. itself still has active nuclear warheads. So we want the U.S. and other nations that also have active nuclear warheads, and by the way, participate in everyday violence against people abroad, to limit the nuclear capabilities of Iran. I think there's some holes here that definitely need to be analyzed more.
Pope Francis is planning a 3-day visit to Cuba next week, and in preparation, the government of President Raul Castro has said it will release 3,500 prisoners as a goodwill gesture. Some inmates were due to be released next year anyway, and those people in prison for crimes against state security will remain behind bars, which rules out some high-profile dissidents. The Pope will arrive in Havana ahead of his highly anticipated visit to the U.S. He was apparently instrumental behind the scenes in fostering a resumption of diplomatic ties between the U.S. and Cuba. Despite Cuba's communist ideals, the Catholic Church has a strong presence on the island. If his health permits, the ailing Fidel Castro may also meet with Pope Francis. Cuban opposition to the Castro regime in the U.S. is critical of Pope Francis's silence on what they see as human rights violations. Cristina, this Pope has shown that he can be a major player on international policy. Is that a good thing?
Well, again, I think another complicated answer. So you have the Pope, who has shown that he's been on the right side of some issues. So in that sense, it is helpful to have his influence on international policy, especially in the case of U.S.-Cuba relations. But do we want to rely on the Pope? Maybe not, right? So there's a long history of persecution, oppression, human rights violations by the Catholic Church itself in Latin America. So I think that's an important part of history that shouldn't be forgotten. After all, it plays a big part in where Latin America is today. And of course, the Castros are very well aware of this history, since they have defied the church themselves in the past.
And finally, here in the United States, in a surprise move, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, has been dealt a major blow to its approval of a class of bee-killing pesticides, despite many studies pointing to the role of so-called neonicotinoids to bee colony collapse disorder. The EPA had approved the pesticides, and so a federal appeals court on Thursday struck down that approval specifically for one pesticide called sulfoxaflor. According to Mother Jones, the court cited the precariousness of bee populations and flawed and limited data submitted by Dow on the pesticide's effects on beleaguered pollinating insects. Dow Chemicals and Bayer are among the top manufacturers of the pesticide. Beekeepers, scientists, and environmentalists have been warning the EPA for years against the use of such neonicotinoids. Well, Cristina, this court actually demanded the EPA apply the precautionary principle, that is, prove something is safe before you allow it, rather than what it usually does, which is allow it until proven unsafe. How important is this decision?
Well, we know that the few, I should say, multinational agricultural companies that exist, for instance, Monsanto is one of them, have been employing their own scientists to produce research that often benefits the corporation itself. And all too often, the EPA has followed along, approving varying degrees of levels of hormones in milk and food products, for example. So what we're seeing is finally an example where real independent research is showing us how uncertain and dangerous our agricultural economy is. And it's also important to see that it's not correct to say that something is better and safe if you can't prove the effects. Not knowing the short-term and or long-term effects of our products have on living species is actually more dangerous. So hopefully we can continue this trend.
Cristina, I always appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is our daily Newsflash guest expert on Fridays. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. When we come back, a September 11th anniversary special. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. It has been exactly 14 years since the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in D.C., when nearly 3,000 people were killed and thousands more injured. That harrowing day in history marked a moment from which so many different threads emerged that continue to shape this country and our world. Today, given the state of the Middle East and the Muslim world, we'll examine the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy and how the wars that began in 2001 created regional instability for millions and has made us even less safe. We'll also survey the damage done to our civil liberties with the revelations of mass surveillance on the general public, but also the targeting of Muslims in particular, and how Muslims here in the U.S. have been living in a climate of fear that extends today. My guest is Hussam Ayloush. He is the executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations and also an executive board member of the California Democratic Party. Welcome to Uprising, Hussam.
Thank you, Sonali. It's always a pleasure being on the show.
Now, do you remember what you were doing on the day when you first saw what was unfolding in New York and D.C.? I think all of us sort of remember that day. Did you have an inkling of what was in store?
Yeah, I mean, like most of us were, especially on the West Coast, getting ready to go to work or preparing our kids for school. That was my case. And then I got the dreadful call from friends, and I have a cousin in New York, and actually some of my colleagues from CARE. And you know, whatever happened after that has been just a continuation of injustice, you know, from that day of injustice to the targeting and the scapegoating of American Muslims, and then eventually to Islam itself with the Islamophobia industry and the targeting through law enforcement agencies, and we're still dealing with it locally and globally.
Today, the Islamic State is an even more dangerous incarnation of Al-Qaeda. We were told that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban 14 years ago were the most evil groupings known to humanity, in modern times at least, that inexplicably wanted to just kill Americans. And that was, of course, used to justify not just the wars, but the detention and Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and Bagram, the torture, the bombings. And now we have ISIS, which many label a death cult. Should we be surprised that ISIS emerged from the ashes of those actions?
I mean, it doesn't take a genius to know that bad policies produce bad results. And Al-Qaeda was a result of those bad policies. And of course, Al-Qaeda 2.0, which is ISIS, is a continuation of those bad policies that started with the wrong response to 9/11. 9/11 was a horrific act that needed a very measured response that actually could have been an opportunity to bring people together, people who care about democracy and freedom and tolerance against those who believe in the other perspective, the extremism, the imperialism, the occupation. But unfortunately, the neocons exploited that horrific event to advance their own agenda in the region, and including obviously the two bad or ill-advised invasions, which resulted turning Iraq into a country where it, before the invasion, had zero presence of Al-Qaeda, to becoming the base of Al-Qaeda, and then became eventually Al-Qaeda from Iraq itself became ISIS. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem we've learned anything. I mean, I would like to blame the neocons for that, but unfortunately, even post-neocons administrations have not learned. You know, we're back today. We're a democratic administration. I'm a Democrat, but I can say that. Unfortunately, we're back into supporting dictatorships in the region in the name of keeping away extremists. Unfortunately, it's that repression and those repressive regimes that we support abroad that have unfortunately created the fertile ground for groups like ISIS. When we support military coups, when we support governments that we know violate human rights, when we support governments that we know engage in racist occupation and apartheid policies, we're creating that injustice. So it seems we haven't learned much, or maybe we prefer political expediency, we prefer short-term solutions to that of long-term ones.
I want to go back to the wars, the two wars that first emerged out of the 9/11 attacks. First, Afghanistan. The Bush administration wanted very clearly, they were desperate to find a reason to go into Iraq even before the 9/11 attacks. And after 9/11, of course, they needed some time to build the myth of weapons of mass destruction. So they started in Afghanistan, then went to Iraq. These two countries, we were told specifically the U.S. would save Afghans from the Taliban and save Iraqis from Saddam Hussein, while saving Americans from the evils of these tyrannical regimes. And now where are Afghans and Iraqis? We don't even get much news coverage of them anymore.
Well, obviously we don't care about the plight of women in Afghanistan anymore, or the plight of children, or the Kurds, or the Shias, or the minorities in Iraq, whom we turn their life more miserable today. There's a chaos that was created. There's no doubt about it. Taliban engage in repressive actions and ideologies. There's no debate that Saddam engaged in dictatorial repressive practices. But that was not the way to deal with it, obviously. What we ended up creating in that region is chaos and a bad example. We in a way proved that we were not serious about democracy and about freedom. There were specific agendas that needed to be advanced. Unfortunately, that chaos that we created in the region, specifically in Iraq, we're dealing with it as we speak today in a form of chaos that has spread in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in obviously Libya, in Egypt. Even the Gulf countries that used to be, stable places are no longer stable. And I think what is needed is a change in the way we address the Middle East and we deal with the Middle East. We must be serious about respecting human rights. Obviously, we can't talk much about human rights when we are the ones who have allowed our CIA to engage in torture and death. We've allowed our military and our CIA to engage in, obviously, illegal detention of people in Guantanamo Bay and mistreatment of people. We've lost the moral ground, the credibility to be even pointing at any finger at any country in that region and say, hey, this country, don't engage in that, because they look back at us and say, who's talking? You haven't fixed your own problems. So we need to look back at what has happened since 9/11. It's obviously not too late to change that policies and that practice internally and of course globally.
Now, Hussam, there was a moment in the past decade and a half where there was some hope when the Arab Spring revolutions, began in one country after another, Tunisia and Egypt, etc. But then U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and others, and the military regime in Egypt, the post-revolutionary regime, crushed those rebellions, crushed the democratic aspirations of the very people that could have helped to bring about democracy and human rights after probably going through some political instability to that region. And we're not just right back where we started, but perhaps even worse off, and maybe definitely worse off than before the 9/11 attacks.
It's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking because there were a lot of hopes in that region, especially after the president's speech in Cairo, in Indonesia. President Obama, I'm talking about here, when he promised that we no longer are going to support dictatorships. We're here to stand by the people, the rights of the people, freedoms, human rights, democracy, all the great values he preached to the region. It gave hope. That's why we saw people, young people mainly, educated people, in the streets, running, walking, protesting, peaceful in Egypt, in Syria, in Tunisia, in Bahrain, in Libya, Yemen, in many other places, in Morocco, believing the false hope we promised them that we will stand by them. And eventually, I think our administration, our government, believed the Kool-Aid from dictators who told basically our administration, you have to choose. If you allow for democracy, it's going to be Islamic or Islamic extremists, basically. So it's either us, dictatorships, or government that will not be popular or will not be maybe puppet regimes to you and for your policies. And I think, unfortunately, as much as the president has promised that we will not be continuing this 50 years of policy in the Middle East, we went back to it and we decided, for example, a repressive, murderous military coup in Egypt is far off better for us than, because it brings some kind of stability and continuation of protection of Israeli interests in the region, as opposed to having a democracy that might bring people that we might not like because they are too independent. But unfortunately, this will backfire. There's no debate about it. It will backfire in the form of extremism because we're pushing people away from democratic, peaceful means. And unfortunately, horrific examples such as ISIS become attractive to some people, to some young people who feel this is the only hope. And this is definitely not in the interest of the region and definitely not in the interest of our country.
Hussam, let's turn to the atmosphere inside the U.S. Over the past 14 years, yesterday reports emerged of a horrific hate crime against a Sikh man named Inderjeet Singh Mukhar, who was viciously beaten and told terrorist Bin Laden, go back to your country. I'm sure the criminals who beat him assumed he was a Muslim because of the Sikh headdress and facial hair. And we would have thought that, and many Sikhs have paid the terrible price of being victims of hate crimes, and Muslims have as well since 9/11. And we would have thought that 14 years later that such hate crimes would have slowed down. Have they?
Unfortunately, they haven't. And ironically, this victim, the Sikh victim in Illinois, only 14 years ago, right after 9/11, the first murder victim of a hate crime in reaction to 9/11 was also a Sikh person in Arizona. And it tells you, if anything, it shows us that bigots are not the smartest people. They can't differentiate between who is who. They just see a dark person, maybe with a turban, with a beard, and they think they're all like Bin Laden. But the problem is there has been an industry, an Islamophobia industry that has formed through certain right-wing media, through certain think tanks and organizations and pundits who go around publishing books, comments, building fear of Islam. We've seen the result of that increase in hate incidents, bullying cases, discrimination cases. Now we hear about Muslim-free zones or Muslim-free businesses announcing and popping up around the country. Of course, this has led to the justification of a whole series of unfair targeting of Muslims by law enforcement. You know, NSA spying, FBI entrapment, spying on Muslims, arrest of Muslims by various law enforcement agencies. And there has been an acceptance for that, because when you have the demonization of the other, and that other is Muslims or those who look like Muslims, any obviously brown people, uh, it's unfortunately staining our society. This is not to say that most people buy into that, but all it takes is for few people to be pushed over the edge, and then we see horrific incidents like the one that happened 2 days ago against the Sikh man in Illinois, or the three young people in Chapel Hill in North Carolina, the Muslims who were killed. So, you know, someone with some sanity on all sides, and especially the right-wing sides, need to realize that what they're doing is pushing our country into a very dangerous abyss.
And so there is a spectrum between those individuals who commit hate crimes and people who are actually politicians, elected officials, and then the hate industry in the middle, people like Pamela Geller, who give some kind of intellectual or pseudo-intellectual cover to creating this hysteria. And so it extends all the way from politicians pushing authors, pushing radio and television hosts, pushing, you know, shock jocks, etc., pushing individuals to commit these crimes against Muslims. And that is kind of this industry that's been built up over 14 years. But then you also have things that the government has engaged in under cover of having to root out terrorism under the Department of Homeland Security, which came out of 9/11. We got the Department of Homeland Security, a terrible sounding name for an agency, by the way. It really sounded like it could have emerged from Nazi Germany, the homeland. And under Homeland Security, we have a different kind of targeting of Muslims, don't we, with FBI informants, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, the FBI is with the Department of Justice specifically, but you're absolutely right. The DHS recently, and in association with DOJ, have been talking about promoting a new program called Countering of Violent Extremism, which sounds like a great thing because violent extremism is bad, except that this is just a pseudo name, or maybe just a fake excuse to target American Muslims. It turns out that this program only targets American Muslims at a time when all numbers, all statistics, even from the DHS itself, point out that the number one threat of violent extremism had been right-wing white supremacist groups. But nevertheless, it is only popular to target American Muslims. Whereas, yes, there are some American Muslims, young Muslims, who have engaged in extremism and joined maybe ISIS. But when you compare it to all other communities, it's the same number. You know, always there's a tiny number of people who get swayed by KKK, by gangs, by cults. There isn't a problem that we can say that is overwhelmingly American Muslim. But yet our own government is selectively targeting that community, which unfortunately becomes the talking points for right-wing groups, where they can now even target American Muslims even more and blame them for all acts of terror or extremism or violence. Unfortunately, American Muslims today feel that they are the punching bag of some politicians. You know, we have almost every Republican presidential candidate competing in bad-mouthing Muslims, attacking Islam, and blaming Islam and Muslims for the ills of the world today. Obviously, no one wants to take responsibility for our own policies that are messing up the whole world nowadays. But they can get away with it because, unfortunately, there isn't a critical mass of objection and opposition to the demonizing of Muslims. Something similar to what we, of course, read about in other places in our part of the history, Nazism. You know, hate incidents do not happen in a vacuum. Hate incidents are the direct result of a climate of fear and hatred and racism that is fanned by some people. And in this case, politicians, right-wing media, and some think tanks are fanning the fires and the flames of hatred against American Muslims in ways that unfortunately is changing even the fabric of our country. You know, the freedoms, the privacy laws that we enjoyed, the talks about tolerance, you know, are being challenged today, not by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, I have to say, but actually by people who falsely claim to be fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, where at this, when they're really nothing but the other side of that coin of Al-Qaeda. It's a message of extremism, intolerance, hatred. ISIS is good at pushing it overseas, but unfortunately we have their counterpart here in our own country who feed off and help each other in promoting that environment of fear and hatred.
Well, Hussam, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on this anniversary. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
My guest is Hussam Ayloush. He is the Executive Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, also an Executive Board Member of the California Democratic Party. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The California Employment Development Department ruled in August, in a decision that was just revealed this week, that the app-based ride-hailing company Uber must treat its drivers as employees. The ruling was over a claim by an unnamed driver last April who filed for unemployment benefits. Uber has more than 1 million drivers worldwide. This California decision is just the latest in a series of labor rulings that spell trouble for the company. Earlier in the year, the California Labor Commissioner and its counterpart in Florida made similar rulings over employee benefits. Uber would like to treat its drivers as independent contractors, which of course help keep profits up and costs down. But on September 1st, a federal judge ruled that California's Uber drivers could join a class action lawsuit against the company for treating them like employees while denying them benefits. Uber is currently valued at more than $50 billion. My guest is Stephen Hill. He is a senior fellow with the New America Foundation and a Holtzbrink fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. He is a political writer and author of 5 books, including the forthcoming Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. It's going to be out in October. Welcome to Uprising, Stephen.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So what are the working conditions of Uber drivers for those in our audience who might never have taken an Uber ride, or maybe, are most likely not, or probably not Uber drivers? Typically, they sign up to be drivers, right? And then when someone requests a ride on their phone app, the driver can respond. There's no money exchanged between the driver and the rider, so Uber handles all the financial transactions electronically, and then the driver gets paid eventually. How badly are they paid? I'm guessing not too well, given that Uber rides are often cheaper than taxi rides.
Yeah, well, the data is not real clear on this point. The only data we have is what Uber provides, and I think you can trust Uber's numbers about as much as you can trust China's or Greece's numbers. And at one point, the CEO of Uber, Travis Kalanick, was running around saying that Uber drivers who drive full time were making $100,000 per year. That it didn't even pass the laugh test.
Wow, where do I sign up?
Exactly. You had major media outlets like the Washington Post and others reporting this at face value. No one even sort of questioned it. And Kalanick even became so bold as to say, I challenge any of you journalists, if you don't believe me, go ride with some of the Uber drivers and ask for their pay stubs. So some enterprising journalists did that. And in fact, what they discovered is that many Uber drivers aren't even making minimum wage. They, especially once you factor in the costs of driving, gasoline, tolls, parking tickets you might get, all these sorts of factors.
Insurance, of course, yeah.
All these things, they come out to $7,000 to $10,000 per year. So once you subtract that, it's really not very good for a lot of drivers. There was a report put out by Uber that was signed on to by a Princeton economist, Alan Kruger, which said that drivers in Los Angeles, for example, and Washington, D.C. were making about $17 per hour. In San Francisco, about $23 per hour. But again, once you did the math and you looked at how many hours a driver would have to drive in order to make that, they'd basically be strapped into their car for their entire lives. So, we don't have definitive data on it, but what we do have points to that this is, for some people, a decent paying job, for others, not so decent. And most of the Uber drivers, according to Uber's own internal numbers, only drive part-time. 80% of them are driving part-time, and half of them are driving fewer than 15 hours a week. So, and you see a pattern here where the drivers who drive it the most hate it the most, and those who drive it the least, so they're doing it for extra money. It's not a bad way to earn extra money, so they seem to be more satisfied.
So are these legal challenges and even this class action lawsuit with these drivers now being able to join this lawsuit, is that Uber drivers saying that they want to be treated like employees of a traditional taxi company, except in this case their company is instead, it doesn't have a central switchboard, it just connects drivers to riders with an app?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of cases at this point in which drivers have filed complaints saying they think they're an employee, not an independent contractor. The reason why this is important is because if I'm an employer and I hire an independent contractor, I cut my labor costs by at least 30% because I don't have to pay for Social Security, Medicare, injured worker compensation, unemployment compensation, and for some employers, health care, paid sick leave, paid vacations, all these sorts of things. So you get out of all of that, and that's why this is such an important point. So far, the cases that have been adjudicated have only been for individual drivers. And with approximately 160,000 Uber drivers in the United States, if you try to figure this out case by case, it could take forever. And so that's why, importantly, there's been a class action lawsuit in which just recently a federal court ruled that Uber drivers can be considered a class. So you don't have to do it one driver at a time. You can sue for a class en masse. So this is really where, if Uber can't, and not just Uber, but other so-called sharing economy companies like TaskRabbit and Instacart and a lot of others, if they can't treat their workers as independent contractors, it really does upend their model and their profit model to the point where we'll see if the venture capitalists who are pouring billions of dollars into these companies want to continue doing it.
So how much of what companies like Uber are trying to do is essentially a return to the corporate dominated era when there were essentially no workplace protections, but sort of using the new tech era as a reason to rewrite the rules of labor? In the US, we have appallingly few protections for workers, but there are a few thanks to the labor movement. Do Uber and big tech companies think that we just don't need that, and that these so-called flexible workers, which is the buzzword that we always hear, are the ones that are going to, make the new economy grow?
Well, it's not a question of whether the employers or the corporations who are doing this think we don't need this. They just want to make as much profit as possible. I'll give you an example. The large pharmaceutical company Merck, they owned a plant outside of Philadelphia with 400 employees. Merck sells the plant to another company. The company lays off all 400 workers, then hires back all 400 workers as independent contractors and proceeds to contract with Merck to make the exact same drugs at that plant that they were making before when Merck owned the plant. So this is the incentive that employers have. It's what I call the steroids of the economy. If I'm an employer and you're an employer and you are using all independent contractors and saving 30% on your labor costs, then it puts pressure on me to do the same thing. I mean, why is, and the important part of this sharing economy, this app-based on-demand gig economy, as it's called, what's so important about that is that if I as an employer can hire all independent contractors now so easily using this app, and my ability to hire and fire is made so easy, why would I ever hire a regular permanent employee ever again? And increasingly, we're seeing a lot of companies that are trying to go to this kind of strategy, and it's a snowball effect. Once one company is doing it, then other companies start doing it in order to keep up with the competition. So that's what's happening. Then and even for some of the regular part-time workers we have today, who are subject to what we call just-in-time scheduling, where you don't even know what your schedule is from week to week and sometimes day to day. And some workers show up to work and the employer says, it turns out demand is low today. We don't need you, so just go home. These are the abuses that are occurring in the labor markets that we have to really look carefully at how to not only crack down on them, but how to create a modern safety net that's going to work in this new economy.
So much of what you are saying sounds frighteningly familiar to me and some of my fellow workers, sadly, at our radio station as well. What would it mean for Uber to financially be forced into treating its drivers as employees? Are they claiming that if they were to have to switch from treating them as independent contractors to actually treating them as their workers, that it would bankrupt the company, this $50 billion company?
No, they don't even make a claim like that. They just insist with all the lawyers that a $51 billion valued company can buy that these workers are in fact not employees. They are independent contractors, and they are willing to go to the mat because this really does threaten their economic model and their investors. Keep in mind, this is a company like other companies, Airbnb and others of the sharing economy. They're heading for their IPO. Their initial public offering, in which they will hope to be valued like Facebook and blow up like Facebook became this huge big corporation. And so it's all about market share at this point. They're all trying to spend all sorts of money that they're getting from private investors to get as much market share as they can. But here's, I think, in some ways, the point that we have to really think about. Instead of engaging this game of whether the employee is a contractor or a worker or a freelancer or a 1099 worker versus W-2 wage worker, we have to get past these categories. And so the proposal that I've put forth in my book, Raw Deal, is it basically says it doesn't matter if you hire a contractor or a regular W-2 worker. You still have to put some money towards this worker's safety net. I mean, this is how many other countries do it, in Europe and in Canada and elsewhere. They create what's called legal parity between all these different classifications of workers, because even if the Uber drivers win their lawsuit, Uber will look for another loophole that will somehow classify these drivers in a way that denies them from receiving their safety net and decent treatment. So if we have a proposal, if we put something forward, and other people are starting to talk about this too. Senator Mark Warner for Virginia is talking about having a safety net that's sort of like what they had in the old union halls, the jobs bank, as it was, an hours bank, as it's called, where, think about it, a lot of carpenters and construction workers, they would have multiple employers throughout the year. They'd work one job for 3 weeks, another job for 2 months. But each employer would have to pay something into a fund that was set up for that worker in what I call individual security accounts that the worker would then use to purchase their health care, their paid sick leave, paid vacations. The employer would also have to pay into the established funds for Social Security and Medicare. This, to me, is the way to go, using these individual security accounts in a multi-employer world, because many employees today not only have multiple employers, they have multiple employers in a single day. Using TaskRabbit and Instacart and all these different app-driven gig economy companies. We have to come up with a safety net and a way to preserve what we had as part of the New Deal economy that will work in this new economy. And that's really, I think, where this conversation is going to have to go.
Well, I want to thank you, Stephen, so much for joining us today, and good luck with your forthcoming book.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sonali, and good luck there.
Stephen Hill is a senior fellow with the New America Foundation, a Holt Spring fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. He's a political writer. He's written 5 books. His forthcoming book is Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. It's going to be out in October. When we come back, we will take a look at a very interesting story about death and burial rituals, why they're so polluting to the earth, and a new movement to green death. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. There was a scene in the groundbreaking HBO drama years ago called 6 Feet Under, when the lead character, Nate Fisher, a funeral director who embalms dead bodies and buries them in caskets for a living, decides to bury the remains of his dead wife directly in the ground. It was as she wanted, consistent with her environmental consciousness. The scene was poignant, a moment in a television series that treated death with a kind of dispassionate humor. But it raised an important question. Why do most Americans chemically treat our dead, encase them in satin-lined wood or metal boxes, and bury them deep in the ground? The question of how to reduce our final footprint on the planet is tackled in a new book by my guest, Suzanne Kelly. Her book is called Greening Death, Reclaiming Burial Practices and Restoring Our Tie to the Earth. And she now joins me. Welcome to Uprising, Suzanne.
Thank you for having me, Sonali.
It's a strange question to think about, how we bury our dead, one that most people, even environmentalists, probably don't consider very often. What was the journey that led you to write this book?
Well, it was about 15 years ago, really. I was, in 2000, I was deeply enmeshed in my new PhD studies when my father died quite suddenly. And it wasn't as though I hadn't experienced death before. I had grown up in a large Irish Catholic family, at least on my father's side, and I had been going to wakes and funerals since before I could remember. But I think there was something about the primariness of the death combined with the studies that I was immersed in, including, in particular, environmental feminist philosophies of nature and the body, thinking about them as both playground and dump. And these same questions started to shift to the dead body, what we think of the dead body, what we do with the dead body in the U.S., and why. And I really was happy to find out pretty soon after that there was sort of an awakening happening throughout the U.S. slowly, that there were other people asking these similar questions.
So how bad for the earth are our contemporary and sort of standard burial practices? Isn't straight burial into the earth, which would perhaps be the most natural way to dispose of a body, isn't that considered dangerous and unsanitary?
Well, the practices that I mostly focus on in the book are the practices that the green burial movement takes up. And those contaminating practices are largely chemical embalming, the use of sealed hardwood and metal caskets, and the use of burial vaults, most often made out of reinforced concrete. Now, I should say that these are polluting and contaminating. They are not the dire things of fracking, but they are part of sort of a larger picture of pollution and sort of the detrimental way that we continue to dump on and treat the earth. And I'll just give you some examples of how they are detrimental. The embalming fluid is a carcinogen, a known carcinogen, and while it is biodegradable, it does pose a threat to worker health when it's breathed as a vapor. We dump tons of board feet of hardwood into the ground every year in our cemeteries, as well as reinforced concrete. And if that's not bad enough in terms of the using up of resources, it's been shown in some studies that those things actually leach into the silt loam, and there's been elevated levels shown of cobalt and zinc and lead. And some burial vaults actually are made out of plastic, which can also leach into the soil, as well as asphalt, which we know is a semi-solid form of petroleum. To answer your next question about the dead body being dangerous on its own to be buried without these sort of things around it, I guess the short answer is no. I mean, most cemeteries have to follow guidelines about, not burying too close to bodies of water, but that would be true in any burial ground, whether it's green or conventional. But there is this prevailing social belief that somehow the dead body is this dangerous contaminant that's going to wreak havoc on the living. But even the World Health Organization has been urging the public to understand, as recent as the 1980s, really, that it's best to tend to the living, for instance, in times of natural disaster, and tend to the dead second. There shouldn't be a rush to tend to bury the dead. I mean, unless a body is infected with a virus like Ebola, which is very dangerous. Most dead bodies don't pose a sort of a public health threat.
So the pathogens in the body usually die with the body?
Yes, they do, typically.
Now, how did we get to the place where we are in the U.S. today with all the embalming and the satin-lined caskets and, the place we are? I mean, and I should mention different cultures, of course, dispose of their dead in very different ways. But here in the U.S., the primary method, there's an industry, of course, a funerary industry with the caskets and the embalming and the burial. It's very expensive, I should also add. Is this just sort of leftover religious ritual?
In fact, it's not. I think what's interesting about this is that there are great examples of religious ritual that actually still try to, as much as they can, adhere to these so-called dust-to-dust practices. We know that Jews, for instance, typically bury quickly without embalming and in a pine box and without the use of a vault, that Muslims use shrouds and also do not rely on embalming. But there are many cemeteries throughout the U.S. that actually force Jews and Muslims to adhere to some vault standards by using partial vault. So they actually interrupt those religious rituals. And there's also evidence in Christian liturgy, as other theologians have pointed out, of dust-to-dust practices. So the history of U.S. funerary practices really started 150 years ago. It didn't have much to do with religion. The Civil War is often pointed to as sort of the linchpin, the moment when they started to shift, and the Civil War had an enormous impact on the way that we came to do death in the U.S. But it actually started a bit before that, in the 1830s, when a rise in urban populations collided with new fears around sanitation. This was a time when diseases like cholera and smallpox and measles started to spread through cities and towns and villages like wildfire, and people were trying to figure out how people were getting sick. It was sort of before we understood how people got sick and died from these things. There was a belief that even the stink of things could actually cause us to get ill and to even kill us. And so a lot of attention started to be paid to these stinky places like human waste, sewage, garbage, and also our graveyards. This was before the rise of what we now know as cemeteries. Most people then were talking about colonizers. I should be clear about this, not
Right.
Native American practices. That they were buried, on the farm in the back 40, but if they were in a village or a town or a city, they were buried in a church graveyard. Well, because of these fears that weren't really understood, they basically started to ban the dead from these centers. And many, I should say, cities and towns actually passed legislation that said the dead couldn't be buried there any longer. This, interestingly, gave rise to what's known as the rural cemetery movement. These rural cemeteries started to be built on the outskirts of town, which in some ways was a positive thing because they were like these bucolic oases. They were these natural, gorgeous places, well planned out, where the living would actually go and spend time, have weddings, have picnics, spend weekends. It actually was the precursor to the parks movement in the U.S. They were our first parks. But we should remember that the reason why it started, that actually started at all, was because we had this sort of terrifying fear that the dead body could actually harm us in really irreparable ways. Now that was sort of that happened first, and then we have 1860s. We've got the war, and we have all of these soldiers from the north dying in the south, and how do we get them home for burial if rail cars are hot? The only way to do that is to preserve bodies. Now, before this time, embalming had existed for thousands of years, but in the U.S., it had really been considered a fate worse than death. There was a new kind of method of embalming that was on the scene with anatomists who were preserving bodies for specimens, and they were called upon by the Union Army for families who could afford it, come in and actually preserve the dead and send them back home. Now, you would think that that practice would die when the war ended, that it was sort of a temporary solution to a terrible problem. But in fact, it only kind of got stronger, and there were really two reasons for this. One, when Abraham Lincoln died, his body was embalmed, and it was re-embalmed and embalmed and re-embalmed, and it was traveled across the country for Americans to gaze upon.
Sentimental reasons, basically.
Sentimental reasons, and some historians say, that it also represented symbolically a kind of overcoming of this war that had parted a nation. So it had a huge emotional impact, on the public, and I think it also represented ultimately another kind of an overcoming of nature. The other thing that got embalming going was that these chemical companies, sort of capitalism, they saw an opportunity to sell their chemicals, so they started giving trainings on how to embalm. And these folks who took the trainings really became our first funeral directors. Before that, death care was much more informal economy, done really by the women of the family. So that's how it sort of took root. And they also, to get back to the sanitation point, they sold the idea of embalming in part around the promise of preservation, but there was also the fear of sanitation.
I mean, there are other practices as well. There's cremation, which Hindus and some other cultures do. That can also be, of course, polluting, even though the modern methods of cremation might be different from traditional methods. This is a minority in India called the Parsis, who generations ago came from Persia. Freddie Mercury, incidentally, the lead singer of Queen, was a Parsi. They're Zoroastrian, and their death ritual sounds a little ghastly, but might actually be environmentally friendly. They leave their dead out in what's called a tower of silence, where birds of prey literally eat the flesh till there's nothing left. There,
Yes.
so different cultures treat death in different ways, and it might be that that we have something to learn from them. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let me speak to the cremation matter first. So the truth is, and this is really important in the U.S., is that we're at 50% of bodies that are cremated in the U.S. right now. So conventional
Wow.
burial, yeah, it's just reached that this year. So it's not 50% in every state, but across the U.S. it's
Is
at
that because it's
50%.
cheaper?
I think, yeah, cost has really driven it up. I think that's certainly been the main reason. And in some states like Washington State, I think it's as high as 80%. So it's really gone up. And I think that the green burial movement largely regards cremation, and I want to speak for everybody in the movement, as the second most environmentally sound way of disposing of the dead. Because anytime you burn something, you pose a threat to soil, water, and air. So I think green burial advocates are, trying to get better filters on our crematories to filter out byproducts like mercury from dental fillings and furans, and to find more energy efficient ways to run our crematories as they have been doing in Europe now for a while. But the interesting thing about cremation is that 150 years ago, when we had these so-called dust-to-dust practices, cremation wasn't even a possibility. The modern crematory, only came onto the scene at around the late 19th, early 20th century, and then really didn't build up steam until the 1920s, and then really big in the middle of the century. And we've never been, as other parts of the world, burning bodies has been around for thousands of years, but pyre burning has never been practiced with any regularity in the U.S. But to get to your other point about the what is I think called sky burial in Tibet, is I remember when I actually was an undergraduate, I had a friend of mine who went on exchange to Tibet, and she came back and told me this story, right? And she said the bones were just picked completely clean. She actually witnessed it. And I'd forgotten about the story. And then when when I started getting involved with this, it came back to me so quickly. The other thing that comes to mind when you mention that is the work of the Australian environmental feminist philosopher whose work I draw upon quite richly in my book. And she wrote this piece called Tasteless before she died in 2008, where she tries to get us to think about ourselves within the food chain, to think about ourselves, our own foodiness, as she calls it, right? To think about ourselves
Right.
as essentially as part of nature. And I think that this image of
Our
of
bodies are the products of the food that we've eaten, and we ought, probably when
true,
we die, ought to become fertilizer. I mean,
indeed.
to be sort of unsentimental about it, but the problem is, of course, we are sentimental creatures. Let's talk about, in the last few minutes of our conversation, what a green burial is. If there's somebody who is confronted at this moment with the prospect of having to, deal with their own forthcoming burial, which we all will, of course, at one point, but maybe somebody they love has just died or will be just dying, what could they possibly do?
Yeah, well, I should say that most green burial grounds accept interment of cremated remains or whole body remains. Typically, a green burial, and I guess maybe I could give you just an example from our green burial ground in my hometown that we started. You
And
would
you're in
really
New
need to,
York.
in New York, yeah, in Rhinebeck, New York. We You would need to find a green burial ground. It's true that you could be buried on your own property if you check your local ordinances, but let's say you need to find a green burial ground, and this is not easy because they are not everywhere right now. This is the way a burial happens. At our cemetery, families cannot dig the hole, and so we have a skilled caretaker who actually does this. And then the body is lowered into the hole, usually with straps, and family is allowed to participate in that process. We also put in biomass, sticks, twigs, and other leaves and other kinds of things into the hole, usually first, and then the body goes in, and then we put them on top to create a kind of good environment for decomposition to act swiftly, and also to soften the blow of the dirt that goes in. All of the dirt that's taken out of the hole is put back into the hole and actually mounded up rather than sort of made flush, which we see in our conventional lawn cemeteries. It's really pretty simple.
So, how much is this movement growing? Is this, and I'm sure, assuming your book is an attempt to increase awareness of this?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been slow but steady, but there are barriers. There are a lot of barriers to it. I think that, the environmental movement has sort of been connected but sort of distanced, I would say, in sort of the mainstream way. I don't see a lot of mainstream environmental organizations really sort of tapping into the connections here. But it's really a local sort of a leaderless grassroots movement, I say, happening in disparate communities around the U.S. There have been leaders in the movement, like the Green Burial Council, which is a not-for-profit third-party verification organization that sets standards for the burgeoning industry, because there are no real federal or state standards for green burial grounds or for or other kinds of providers. But there are obstacles, and some of which include the fact that it costs a lot to start a cemetery from scratch. Some green burial grounds are attached to conventional burial grounds. They create a section or an area, and so they already have the infrastructure to get it going. But to start a cemetery from scratch, first of all, you need land, and land is expensive. And if it's not a church cemetery or a municipal cemetery, typically you have to put up some sort of a trust fund. In some states, it can be much as $75,000 before you even put a body into the ground. So it is an expensive endeavor, and in that way, it's a very privileged endeavor that doesn't really make green burial accessible to everyone. And most of these green burial grounds right now are not actually where most people live. 80% of the population lives in urban areas, and the majority of them that have popped up are not in urban areas.
Well, Suzanne, I thank you for starting this conversation that hopefully will lead and have a ripple effect around the country. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
My guest is Suzanne Kelly. She's the author of the book we've been discussing, Greening Death, Reclaiming Burial Practices and Restoring Our Tie to the Earth. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Kiana Turner is our production coordinator. Teddy Robinson is our audio engineer. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Also follow us at facebook.com/uprising radio and twitter.com/uprising radio. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you Monday.